Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Andrew Chi, the editor of the Armed Conflict Database and a research fellow here at the Conflict and Security Development Programme at the IISS. Let me welcome you this morning for discussion with Professor Natasha Lindstaedt. Hopefully I've got that right. Natasha is a professor of government at the University of Essex, where she serves as the Deputy Dean of Education for the Social Sciences. Natasha specialises in authoritarian regimes, corruption and failed state, and has written several books on these topics, including Dictators and Dictatorships, The Politics of Dictatorships, Failed States and Institutional Decay, and her forthcoming book, which is entitled Democracies and Authoritarian Regimes as well. Natasha has consulted for United Nations, the EU External Action Service, and IDEA International. She frequently appears on CNN, BBC News, Al Jazeera, Sky News, and France 24. The topic of Natasha's talk is Personalist Rule, Instability, Conflict, and State Failure. This event will be on the record as well. So without further waiting, I'll hand the floor to Natasha, and then we'll open for a Q&A session as well.
Okay, thank you. So is it okay if I sit or stand?
Up to you.
Okay, so I'll be blocking the screen otherwise. Thanks for everyone for coming. As Andrew already mentioned, I study dictatorships and the intersection between authoritarian regimes and a whole host of different things. So it could be development, it could be conflict, it could be state failure, even terrorism. There's so many different things to study with authoritarian regimes, and as has been noted by many different policymakers and big organizations that study democracy, the quality of democracy has been faltering lately. We're seeing growing authoritarianization in consolidated democracies, in flawed democracies, and then even in semi-democracies or semi-authoritarian regimes. And there's a rise in personalism. So it is relevant, I think, to some of the things that the International Strategic Institute is studying with the look at some of the rising personalism in some of these big major powers and what the impact might be. But a lot of this work is focused on just a wider range of countries. It's looking at general trends, but I'm also going to provide an overview of past studies that have been done that have been able to prove a specific impact of this certain type of rule. So I wasn't certain how much knowledge people had about the topic, so I'm going over it maybe in a way that might be just sort of a review of things everybody already knows. But I thought that would be better than getting, just to get everybody on the same page. So the stuff that I'm looking at more recently is looking at the impact of personalist rule and state failure. And so it's looking at not only what happens while a personalist leader is in charge, so this is a type of dictator. It can also appear in sort of decaying democracies or democracies that are starting to erode. You see rising levels of personalism. But what happens afterwards? What do they leave in their wake? And so you start to see a lot of decaying of the state while the personalist leader takes over. It happens well before they leave power, but towards the end they become almost like the glue, because you don't really have institutions by nature. Sort of the definition of state failure is that the institutions are falling apart, and the personalist leader, for their own survival, is trying to erode at these institutions for their own survival. So the warning signs for state failure is often seen as rising levels of corruption, just massive levels of corruption. On a grand scale, you see the rise of a shadow economy, and the shadow economy often is present right before a conflict as well. When we're looking at rising levels of personalism, as the slide indicates, there are several things that start to show up. It could be the installation of loyalists, promotion of family members. You create some new party that came out of nowhere. A new government is created. You're using, and this is part of this general trend of growing authoritarianization, where leaders will use a referendum to give them some sort of mandate to justify their rule. We've seen this in the case of Turkey. But with the rise of many different populist-style leaders, they're using referendums where they use some of their own popularity, where they play favorites, where they try to divide and rule or create in-group, out-group, create enemies, and really polarize their countries. They bring those people that are really fearful to the polls that vote in favor of them because they're the one person that's there that's going to provide security and stability for them. So they use these forms of direct rule, really manipulating the public in order to legitimize their own rule and basically to keep them in power indefinitely, such as to saying, we're going to get rid of term limits. That's not democratic. I'm the leader that everybody loves, so we're going to get rid of these different types of term limits. And this is a popular thing. There's a lot of studies of term limits and how people get rid of term limits in the name of democracy, which is really a sign for that they want to be in power indefinitely. And then the other really big concern that actually affects state failure and conflict is the rise of different types of security services that are not part of the state, some sort of parallel military or a presidential guard, all these different alternative types of security institutions that are not supposed to be loyal to the state or to the citizens that they're protecting, but are actually just supposed to be loyal to the regime or the particular leader. And this is where we can get into really big issues, as we've seen in the case of Yemen, in the case of Libya, in the case of Iraq, that these personalist leaders under Saddam Hussein, under Gaddafi, under Saleh, had created all these different parallel, different types of security institutions that created trouble afterwards because then the military itself wasn't particularly well institutionalized. So in terms of looking at personalist dictatorship in the state, just like a brief overview, I have just a couple of slides on it and may be very familiar to you, where you have a leader that seems to be almost synonymous with the state. They are the state. When we refer to Iraq, we sometimes say Saddam. We used to say Saddam, or Libya, we would refer to him as Gaddafi. And they have a lot of control, a lot of discretion over policy, and concentrate a lot of power in their hands. So I was discussing this a little bit beforehand with Andrew about the DRC, which has experienced many years of personalist rule, but there's clearly variation in the types of personalist rule. It could be that it is one person that is dictating every single decision, but it could be that one person has designated other people to make some of these decisions, as you were kind of describing in the case of the DRC. But the key is that it's very personalized. It's not really about the institutions themselves. It's about people and the power that they themselves hold. You start to see under personalist rule the legislative branch, parliament, whatever, Congress, very, very weak. It doesn't really have the power to do much of anything. They may barely ever be in session. Almost all regimes around the world, whether they're a dictatorship or a democracy, have a legislature. Very, very few don't. But there's varying levels of how much they actually function and what veto power they might have. Then the judiciary becomes subsumed under their control as well. It exists, but they pack it with loyalists who then basically do whatever they want them to do. So there's no checks and balances on the leadership. You have the military being coup-proof, which is probably the most dangerous thing in terms of the impact it has for stability. By coup-proofing it, they could deliberately weaken them. They could deliberately give the military not particularly good access to weapons or training that they want or that they would need to defend the country because they're so afraid of that institution becoming really powerful that they're going to stage a coup against them. They could, as I already mentioned, start to create all these different parallel types of institutions. And they could only recruit people of a particular ethnic group. This can be really, really dangerous if they're recruiting people of a certain religion, a sect, of a certain tribe. Then that military is not a national military. That military is going to stick with that leader until the very end. We've seen this happen with the case of Syria under Assad, recruiting to the upper echelons of the military, mostly Alawites, who then would really have no exit. Normally the military has an exit opportunity which allows them, when there's pressure to democratize, to push for that leader to be ousted. But when these regimes are coup-proofed in a way where co-ethnics have been recruited, this makes it very, very difficult. You also have the state just not functioning anymore, or maybe it never really functioned to begin with, but the bureaucracy is purposely weakened because the leader never really wants the state to function. It's not really in their interest for the state to function because they fear that outside power holders will form that will threaten their power. It's really all about loyalty and recruiting those that might not be that competent but that are undyingly loyal. And the promotions are based on that, the hiring and firing are based on that, and then that makes it very difficult for the state to function. And it could be that then administrative services are delivered based on your identity instead of or based on loyalty instead of based on the fact that, well, every citizen would deserve the same type of service regardless of what their particular identity or level of loyalty is. And then adding to that, this personalist leader tends to surround themselves, like in terms of who's giving them advice about whether or not to go to war, who's giving them advice about what types of economic policies they're going to have, talking about all the most important policy decisions that they could be making. They surround themselves and base their decisions on people who are really, really loyal to them, who might not have that much expertise. They may be fearful or suspicious of those that have high levels of experience. They may be fearful of technocrats. And so they surround themselves by co-ethnics, by family members, by sycophants that are going to tell them what they want to hear, and also engage in very just false reporting of information. And there was excellent work done about this with Saddam Hussein and the horrible intelligence that he had in the second Iraq war, and that people were falsely telling them that they had the ability to counter the US, that they had this number of tanks, this number of weapons, and people had to tell him what he wanted to hear because they feared that they could be ousted or killed. And then the leader, as I already mentioned, not only defines the state, but kind of sees themselves as a messianic type of figure. They're there to solve everything. They're father of the nation. The people can't survive without them, and they cultivate a personality called around them that is so intense that people are sort of mystified by this particular person, and they may enjoy some type of genuine popularity. So this slide just goes over how personalism is measured in all the different data sets that look at personalist dictatorship, which is distinct from like a military form of dictatorship where you have a junta in charge, like for many years had been the case in Nigeria or in Argentina back in the 70s, or a single party in charge, with the most notable case being China under the Communist Party, where there's a lot of people actually making decisions, and that slows down decision-making process, and it also actually means there's going to be more stability. And the party is so big and so well institutionalized that it's not interested at all in coup-proofing the regime. They don't need to. They don't fear that some military is going to try to take over in a coup. And of course, the military junta wouldn't coup-proof itself. And so this is why we see this really only in personalist types of regimes. So I'm not going to go over every single point here on this slide. It's just for reference of how it would be measured in these particular data sets. And I talk a little bit about why these personalist leaders tend to have such a violent exit. They usually don't go down easily. It's usually actually a very protracted, bloody, violent way of leaving power. And that has to do with the fact that they don't have any kind of institutionalized way of managing secession like a single party regime does, usually. I mean, usually it does. Usually a monarchy has rules of secession, and usually even the military, though military regimes are by far the types of regimes that are the most short-lived, is on average only 2 to 3 years. They have a junta that has decision-making that decides, okay, who's going to take over after this, and they generally don't want one person to get to be too powerful because they fear that that will then impact the legitimacy of the military, and the military tends to leave power early on because that they're worried about cracks in their legitimacy. They want to maintain their cohesiveness. But that isn't the case for the personalist leader. They're really paranoid. They're worried that someone's going to oust them. And they have reason to be paranoid because most of the time that's how they're ousted. So what they do is they try to eliminate any kind of potential rivals. They'll deliberately weaken their own party. And you've got sort of this giant pyramid scheme where they are at the top of it, kind of controlling the strings of every single person below them. And everybody is really dependent on them. There are some cases of personalism that were so extreme that the personalist leader had control over every single portfolio that if they left the country, then the country couldn't function. There are other cases where they put other people in charge and it's not as extreme. But this then will really impact what happens. If we look at the case of Gaddafi under Libya, where he ruled sort of by confusion, and people didn't know from one day to the next what their actual job entailed, what he left in his wake was a mess, was complete chaos. In terms of corruption levels, these are other studies that I'm going to mention that talk about the relationship between personalism and corruption. And rising personalism in democracies, in authoritarian regimes, leads to really, really high levels of corruption because these types of leaders try to hoard as much as possible. They think they've got a very short time horizon. They don't think that they're going to be in power forever because people are constantly trying to get them out of power. So they steal as much as possible. So you see kleptocratic behavior prevailing in these types of regimes, like in the case of the Duvaliers of Haiti, which are one of the more noted kleptocratic regimes, with Mobutu of the DRC, Marcos of the Philippines, the Somosas of Nicaragua, Ratsiraka of Madagascar, just to name a few. So the weaker the checks balances, or the weaker the accountability on that particular leader, the more likely they are to steal. There's no one to check them and say, no, you can't do that. So while you may have corruption levels that prevail in all different types of authoritarian regimes, it's more like bureaucratic corruption, lower levels of corruption, some scandals that involve party members, but the level of kleptocracy is like nothing compared to in personalist regimes. I mean, they're stealing in the billions because there's no one to really block them. So in terms of the studies, to give you an overview of the ones that have looked at personalist dictatorship, comparing it to other types of dictatorship and what the outcomes are. So in personalist types of dictatorship, 69% face exile, imprisonment, or death. So they have a really bad ending most of the time, and they know that, and so they have reason to be paranoid. If you compare that with dominant party dictatorships, only 37% do. Findings also suggest that it's an additional reason why personalist dictators start more wars. So there's actually been tons of studies, I just mentioned one there. They are more likely to initiate a war. They're more likely to initiate a war against any other country, and they're more likely to initiate a war against democracies as well. In terms of their mode of exit, this is something I already mentioned, but it's usually very violent. They feel like they can't leave. They are the state. They're going to stick it out until the very end, and they'll listen to sycophants telling them, oh yes, you're fine, you're going to be absolutely fine. You need to stay in power. If you don't stay in power, we can't function without you. So it's very difficult to negotiate with them often. And sometimes you are able to get them to live some sort of life in exile, but it's often more difficult. They're more likely to invest in nuclear weapons. They're more likely to suffer for the reasons I already mentioned, for terrible military intelligence. They don't have accurate military intelligence, which means that they're unpredictable, which means you don't know what they're going to do because they're not operating sort of as like a rational actor where you can kind of predict, well, based on what's rational, how much power they have, how much power this other state has, they're not likely to attack first. In these regimes, we don't know as much about what they're going to do because their intelligence is so shoddy that they could be being told that they have the military capacity to take on anybody. They're more likely to suffer from policy instability. They're less likely to get foreign direct investment. They're most likely to suffer from economic problems of all different sorts, to perform more poorly on infant mortality rates, child mortality rates, maternal death rates, calorie consumption rates. So they perform the worst on every single possible thing that you could look at. And they're also most likely to defy the democratic community in terms of trying to negotiate with them, cooperate with them. They're most likely to say they'll take on a risk. They're happy to take on risk. Single-party regimes, monarchies are less likely to engage in risk. So as I already mentioned, they have bad fates after democratization. And because the regime sort of destroys the institutions, then what's left in their wake is really a void. There's not that much there. And this is because they have done this strategically as a survival strategy, something I already mentioned. So it's difficult to get them to leave power. And so the policy implications of actually a recent study was looking at if you have a third party that's trying to help end a violent conflict with a dictatorship, you might be able to nudge a military regime and a dominant party regime or single party regime towards democratizing by just cutting off aid because they really value that aid and it's so vital to them. With the personalist regime, that wouldn't work. That it would need to be more than just aid. You'd have to also offer safe exile. And so one of the recent studies found that that was a really important thing to note in dealing with these types of regimes in conflict alleviation or ending a conflict. So I already mentioned they're least likely to democratize, and I also mentioned the institutional void and how then this leads sort of a conflict because they've coup-proofed the regime. So you've got what, in the case of Libya, there were all these different tribal groups that were armed. And he did this on purpose in order to play them off one another because he was trying to, do some sort of divide and conquer type of strategy. Then in their wake, there wasn't a national military that could be used in the transition. Instead, we're still seeing Libya struggling with multiple militaries today. At one point, there were thousands of militias. So there has been growing levels of personalism. This is a very crude chart, just giving an overview of it. I don't have this on this particular page. The next page will show it, that in 1988 there was about 23% regimes that were personalist in the world. This is of all the dictatorships. So it's not including democracies. and then that more than doubled to over 40, somewhere around 40% by today. 2010, you can see it's about 40%, somewhere around there. So we see this just been growing levels of personalism in the blue, and then a little bit less single party, but you see a much lower military regimes, about the same monarchy, not changing too much. So we've got a growth or a doubling of personalist dictatorships. The other trend in autocratization that I've already started to mention, but is important to note, is that in the past, autocratic regimes emerged in a coup, with about 75% of those coming to power in a coup. Today, it's more autocratization. About 40% come to power through autocratization, which is sort of this subtle, slow process of they've been elected, so it looks like it's democratic, but they start to slowly erode at the institutions until it's no longer really a democracy. But they keep claiming it's democratic because they hold elections, but the playing field really isn't fair, and we always know who the winner is going to be. They may allow even the opposition to run, but it's a dictatorship, and it's personalist, and they continue to personalize their rule. Another trend in autocratization is we're just seeing autocracies lasting longer. So from right after World War II ended into the 1980s, you saw the typical autocracy lasted only 14 years. But this has nearly doubled to 20 years since the end of the Cold War. So with rising personalism, we're seeing rising levels of aggression, more corruption, and lower chances for democracy. So in connecting this with state failure, I just have a couple of slides that go over what state failure is, but I'm not going to go over them because it should be something we're all pretty familiar with. How it's measured, usually through these proxy measures. It's difficult to actually measure state failure, and the current organizations that measure state failure sometimes conflate outcomes with the actual characteristics of state failure. So there's some methodological issues there. But if you actually to look at it, it really has to do with how the administration works, hiring and promotions. Is it all personalistic? Is there some sort of system in place? It looks really puts a big emphasis on the way the security institutions are run, the types of training, the types of recruitment that happens, the chain of command, whether or not there's some sort of parallel institution, and whether or not it's free from civilian accountability. Of course, there's different ways of measuring it. Tend to measure it by the impact, homicide rates, civil conflict, presence of insurgencies or other violent non-state actors, the collapse of the judicial institutions, how the courts are running, whether or not there's judicial autonomy, transparency, efficiency, access to courts, integrity, accountability, which tends to be measured by rule of law indices or corruption rates, and then the political institutions. So you can be an autocracy and have institutionalized political institutions. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is institutionalized. There, for a while there, up until recently, there was turnover in power of the leader, and there are many autocracies that are well institutionalized. But the thing is about whether it's a personalized system or whether or not you have a party, a legislature. Do you have rules, or is it just about one person? And this can be measured by various democracy scores. So now we're kind of turning towards the end here, where I have just a couple more slides looking at current cases of personalist rule, just to get some context and examples. And not everybody agrees on what is personalist or what is not. I mean, the biggest data set is by Getty's Wright in France. And they've had a data set going on for some time now of what's personalist. There's other data sets that might differ just a little bit. There's people that differ whether or not it's a de facto leader, not a de facto. But these are just some examples of current personalist rule. A lot are concentrated in Africa, but there are other places around the world, like in Venezuela, where we're seeing the impact of personalist rule. I'm just going to pause here to talk about it, because in the case of Venezuela, which was probably decades ago, was one of the richest Latin American countries, had per capita income rates well over 10,000 per capita, lots of oil, turnover in power, corruption, of course. But people wouldn't have predicted Chavez leaves and it's going to be a complete disaster. It's not necessarily a critique of being left or the right. It was because he personalized the regime completely. And then what's left in his wake is just a mess. It's very difficult to run the country at the moment. Of course, there have been bad policies that have contributed to this. We see the case of Libya very similar, because Libya under Gaddafi had very high per capita income rates relative to the region, and lots of oil for a country of only 6 million people, and it wouldn't have been predicted that it would just lead to complete chaos once he leaves. But that's sort of the danger of these personalist types of rulers, that it may look like it's kind of hanging together, and then this person leaves and it's a complete vacuum. It's not always the case, but it would be what you would predict would happen. So some current examples of where there's a hybrid, where they do have a party that has it has some level of institutionalization, meaning it's lived a long time, it's survived a long time. It might even started out with an ideology. So you think of North Korea, Gabon, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, and these regimes, of course, are highly personalistic, and they're becoming increasingly personalistic. And that turns us now to look at some cases where just recently we might be in a transition. Talking to you a lot about the DRC, Sudan, a lot of questions what is going to happen there. Libya, I have there the total years of personalistic type of rule. Afghanistan, Gambia, Burkina Faso, Yemen, still dealing with just massive conflict. And then countries with many, many past years of personalistic rule. And you see that these countries are also the ones, the usual suspects that tend to appear on the failed state indices. And it may be a chicken and egg thing, that they were already weak, and that's what enabled the leader to take over in this way. We don't know this. These are things that we have to continue to study to figure out what's happening here. That they already started off so weak that they were bound to fail, and the leader came in and was able to take advantage of these weak institutions. Or whether the leader came in and was eroding at these institutions worse. And you think of the case of Somalia under Siad Barre. There were periods of time where Somalia wasn't a complete failed state and was offering some education and other services, but he coup-proofed the regime. He pitted clans against one another, deliberately weakened the military in such a way, and left power that there was not much there. And that's the danger of these types of rulers. I'm going to then turn to an examples of personalizing regimes to look out for. Turkey under Erdogan, Russia under Putin continues to personalize. China under Xi Jinping. The danger was when he got rid of term limits. When Mao was in charge of China, as we know, it was very, very personalized, and they were having one economic disaster after another. One of the worst economic disasters that we've seen with the Great Leap Forward, where millions and millions of people died. So the personalism is a bad trend in China. In Saudi Arabia with MBS is a horrible trend. And North Korea under Kim Jong-un, as he's killing off certain people, we see that these regimes are also personalizing. So anything in color are the regimes that are personalistic. Either they just recently were personalistic, or their last autocratic regime that we could note was personalistic. Those are the ones that are not in bold. The hybrids are in orange, as you can see. And if you just look at the bottom 20%, and I don't say that the failed state indices, that these organizations, that the way they measure state failure is perfect, but they have a rough estimate of which countries are really, really unstable. And we see in the bottom 20%, it's over 50% are personalistic, or just recently was personalistic, and 77% have personalism or some kind of hybrid. And so we see that there's clearly a correlation here. Just more needs to be done to study this relationship, and then what policy prescriptions are available. So that's really all I had today to talk about. And I'm just open to questions.
Thank you very much, Natasha. So I'll open the floor to some questions. If you just start by mentioning your name and affiliation.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. My question is about North Korea. So, personalism and civil party system, and they now have a nuclear weapon and ballistic missile. Why do you think North Korea regime is still very stable?
That's been one of the big questions about North Korea. They've established a personality cult unlike the world has ever seen before. We've never seen this level of brainwashing and level ability to maintain totalitarianism. All the other totalitarian regimes eventually fell. They have just been able to kind of stick to this system. It is true that single party and personalists are the most stable. So we have this also in Cuba as well. Some of the other examples that I use, those are really hard to break down because you have a lot of actors that have incentive to stay in power. So in the case of North Korea, they are able to keep all the people they need to be that need to be happy. All the elites get access to luxury goods. The key to bringing down the regime, they've always, policymakers always talk about it, it's that you have to cut off these access to luxury goods to these elites and their access to foreign exchange. So the issue with North Korea, they're able to keep everybody happy. Revolutions are really rare. It's like less than 10% of the time. So it's never really about we've got to keep everybody and prevent them from revolting. They've done a great job of keeping everybody brainwashed, but it's more really just about apathy than anything else. It's then if they can just keep these elites satisfied, invested in the regime, which they're able to do, they see no exit otherwise. What would their life be like if they weren't in power? It'd be, they could be killed. They won't have access to all these perks that they have. And so with all these people that are vested in this system under Kim, there's no chance for some sort of internal liberalization or democratization to happen. And once then a little bit of liberalism or democratization happens and there's an opening, then there's a possibility, at least for an opposition or for people to take to protest or, some kind of elite pact to take place. But it's all shut down. There's no chance for anything because they control literally everything and because the people that they need to keep happy are satisfied.
My name is Jan. I'm here at the Autocracy with the Survival Journal. You talked about that some of these trends may actually appear in consolidated democracies as well. So I'm thinking about Europe, and what comes to my mind is Hungary. So I was wondering if we look at Viktor Orbán, for example, if you see which any of these conditions you mentioned, if he fulfills some of those.
Great.
Let me take more questions.
What'd you say?
Let me take more questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Oh, you wanted to have the questions first?
Let me
and then
take more, yeah. Any other questions, just in case?
Name is Michael Selman of a real estate development firm. We work in Central Asia a lot. Kazakhstan hasn't come up, and I'm curious your thoughts on President Nazarbayev, who by any objective measure is a personalist leader, if not more, but has also been making substantial and perhaps rare moves to democratize the country, including the recent election where he handed over to a caretaker and beyond. So your thoughts on things moving the other direction, perhaps in rare cases?
Am I taking all the questions
No,
first?
just take questions.
Okay, so can I answer the Hungary one first? Okay. So I'll go in order. So the case of Orban is really interesting because he's really personalizing the regime. And if you look at different organizations that measure democracy, some are seeing it as almost semi-authoritarian at the moment because civil liberties have decayed and eroded so much, and he controls so much of the media. He personally is in control of so many things at the party. It's very dangerous. It's a horrible trend in Hungary. It's really backsliding. In fact, in all the big varieties of democracy, it's this huge democracy rating index. Hungary is one of the worst backsliders. And the dangers of all these different problems happening, the types of policies that are going to happen, more risk-taking behavior, but I think we're seeing all of it already, the impact of Orban's personalizing his rule. He recently met with Trump, another personalizer who's creating havoc in the U.S. He is. We have strong enough institutions to deal with it. But they had said, you're kind of controversial. I think that's what Trump said about him. You're kind of controversial. It's very controversial. He's really decayed at institutions. And if you were to see where Hungary used to be, it was like a liberal democracy. And it's just completely fallen to where it's the levels of countries that were, semi-authoritarian. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's personalizing totally. With the Kazakhstan is one of the most interesting cases that we're still trying to figure out what is going on there. It has a party and it has a personalist leader. So that's a very stable system. And it has a lot of oil and gas, of course, so that it has a lot of resources to keep everybody happy. And we would have thought that he would have been in charge for just decades because of, he has such a firm grip on power. He could probably hold elections that were free and fair and he would win. And he had said something along the lines that the opposition wasn't experienced enough to run, and they quoted and they said, yeah, we're not ready yet to run for office. So to me, it looks like he's just grooming someone that he can control and maintain in power. Maybe he's getting older and tired. There's work done on dictators that get old and what they decide to do, and they do get tired and do decide it's time for somebody else. They're tired of it, but they don't tend to ever fully leave. And that would be what we would predict would happen, that he's not really going anywhere. It just looks good. It definitely looks good for legitimacy, and we've seen a lot of these cosmetic democratic processes happen in authoritarian regimes that it turned out wasn't really very democratic. It just looked good, offered them more foreign aid, more support, more access to trade. So maybe that is what happened. It's like a fake out, but we'll see what's happening. It's a very good question, though.
I had a question, which is, you talked about this sort of rise from the 1980s of this personalist behavior in your data. How much of this is actually to do with the influence of Russia and China or the Western states, particularly if you look at the Horn of Africa, where you see this competition between the sort of Middle East players, the sort of Western players, but also what you clearly see is China's influence in these areas. How much of this personalist rule that we see can be attributed to these key players as well?
Well, most of it was due to the Cold War ending, and or during the Cold War, and a particular leader would get really well supported, a strongman. Particularly, actually, Western countries, particularly the U.S., has liked to work with a strongman, someone they could kind of count on, who was pro-Western, anti-communist, and they would work with this particular leader, and that leader would then gain enough support to kind of keep themselves afloat. We can't tell whether or not China or Russia has a preference for working with a particular strongman or not. They've worked with everybody who wants to, who's willing to receive their particular support. But in terms of seeing these institutions kind of decay, fall apart, they have played a huge role in autocratization, in supporting autocrats, whether it's a single party or not, but in supporting them and maintaining them in power by helping them with what tactics you need to defy international observers, media or on social media support, how to undermine opposition, have NGOs but basically undermine them, have civil liberties but figure out ways to subvert that. And so there's been a lot of autocratic cooperation going on. I can't say it's necessarily because they're supporting only personalist leaders over other types of regime, but that's led to growing autocratization. In terms of rising levels of personalism, it's hard to predict what is causing these rising levels of personalism in general. Some of it seems to be a backlash to whatever pre-existing structures were in place, and that people feel like, I think a lot of it is connected to the rise of these populist type of leaders that are selling something very different than what they're offering. And that's why we're seeing rising rates of autocratization. It's all personalistic in nature. It's not because we've got more military regimes, we've got more single party regimes. It's because these types of leaders are selling specific things that people are, desperate for. And that's why we're seeing that more so than China and Russia specifically picking on a certain type of leader.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Ahlam Akram. I'm from Basira for Universal Women's Rights. I couldn't tell but connecting all of these descriptions to the Arab region in particular, where you have and authoritarian regimes 100%. It varies a little bit depending on the wealth of the country and so on. In the case of Erdogan, for instance, he employed religion, to gain legitimacy and to maintain power. And this is a big shift between Erdogan and Ataturk, which was the father of the nation and all of this. But what really surprises me is why the West still deal with these regimes. Why the West, why they lose credibility, they lose all popularity, regardless of their aid or something, by dealing with these regimes, because there is opposition. And don't forget that these regimes generally, they oppose completely civil society, and no mentioning for women, except by employing them to serve them, as what happened in Saudi recently when they employed one of the wealthiest women, empowered women, as an ambassador to the US. Why do the US accept that? Is it maintaining their interest in that area? Prevent them from saying the truth and saying enough is enough. You need to connect with the people, not the regimes. And it's the same situation, if not worse, for supposedly a state in making, Palestine, where Arafat has made everything personalized and he is the leader of the nation and all of these things. So what's insist on dealing with these people?
I think in the Middle East in particular, the West, let's just say, speaking of the US, has always prioritized sort of stability for oil and the importance of oil, and prioritize that over democracy. In Iraq, there was this aberration where they went in and claimed it was about democracy, but it seemed to be based on other factors. The really close relationships with some of the most authoritarian regimes are the monarchies. Western countries have always supported these close relationships because of the needs of having a stable supply of oil. So there hasn't been a real history of supporting democratization in the Middle East at all. And more of a checkered history in Latin America, more checkered in Asia as well, but in the Middle East, really staunchly against it, because also Middle Eastern leaders have said, well, if we have elections, look who's going to get elected. You need me. I'm stable. You can count on me. And there is a preference for that over what they perceive to be the alternative.
The lady here.
Catherine Holman, member of the Institute. It's a very sort of pessimistic thing, isn't it? And I just wondered if you have any. It seems to be, given that if they're removed, things go very badly from that point. Have you examples of countries where, when personalist dictators have been removed, things have worked out? And if so, why in those particular instances, given that usually there's nothing there to build a state from when those leaders go?
Well, I think there's cases where it didn't go to chaos. So in Burkina Faso, I think it was Blaise Compaoré, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name right, he was in power a long time, decades. And they seem to be slowly transitioning to a democracy. There's a couple cases in Africa where you've had personalist rule that's slowly transitioning to democracy. And the other good news thing about Africa is it's the region that is democratizing the most. It's the only region that is not decaying compared to the other regions which are all eroding or witnessing erosion. So there have been some cases where it doesn't just lead to complete chaos. It has a lot to do with various variables and configurations of attaining stability first and coming up to some type of agreement about what the transition is going to look like. We're kind of looking to see what will happen in Sudan. There were many years of personalist rule, and you would predict it would be completely chaotic. But so it's not always the case that that's what happens. I think a lot of it hinges on the military, and whether or not when it starts to break down into militias, that's when it falls apart. With all the different cases where we see it's been chaos and conflict, if the military can somehow stay unified and just protect people, then the transition, then you can let the civilians kind of work out politics, and they might come up with some version of democracy that works for them at the moment, and with time, things sort of evolve. But a lot of it is what happens to the military right afterwards. Do they dissolve into different militias based on some personal leader, and then it's just a free-for-all? Or are they able to stay united somehow?
Continue. No? Okay. You want
the other question. Alessandro Berigoni from International SOS. I wanted to jump in on the previous question about foreign influence. Looking at the African continent, what do you think about the Chinese recent penetration into institutions and government? Do you think for personalist rules this is a more stabilizing factor or destabilizing that could reduce the length of their existence?
I think it's stabilizing if they're providing them with resources that they can use to keep their elites that surround them happy. That's what keeps them in power. When they first take over, they have to keep a lot of people happy. Then it starts to shrink with time, and they have to figure out how many people I have to keep happy. And so they're reliant on foreign aid or whatever type of investment is coming in, and if they are allowed to use that to keep these key people happy, they can stay in power indefinitely. So what shocks them is when it's all gone and they don't have anything left to give, and then it is complete chaos. So I think actually it is a stabilizing influence, whether it come from China or whether it come from a Western country.
Any other questions?
One other, my niche Central Asia theme here. The success story question is an interesting one. In Uzbekistan, which is an odd case, Karimov dies suddenly in fall of 16 after this deep freeze of the country. And Mirziyoyev, the new president, much of his popularity, at least I think, is entirely due to how much better he is treating everyone than his wretched predecessor. Countries opened up, American businesses there. I'm curious, this seems like an interesting, potentially positive story, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, it is a positive story. Again, it's another question mark with because some of the other Central Asian countries like Tajikistan are really faltering, not doing particularly well. Kyrgyzstan's very, very weak as well. With Uzbekistan, it does seem to be sort of a good news story there. I mean, the previous leadership was so oppressive. It's such one of the worst human rights violators. It couldn't really get much worse. I mean, he controlled everything, and so it was stable, and he, had at least that's what he kind of sold people, I think, on. But sometimes the next leader is not as bad. Or doesn't feel the need to be as bad. Maybe he doesn't feel like there's threats coming from anywhere to his power. He might be just more of someone that's committed to democracy. I mean, I don't really have an explanation for it, but it's not unheard of that the personalist leader then is whoever succeeds them might be better. I mean, I think you could say that in Turkmenistan, with Berdi and Turkmenbashi is a little better. But often it's followed by more personalism. It's almost never followed by democracy. But there's some occasional good news stories there, which are interesting to study. It's good to bring up.
I'm Jens Koning. I study international studies at the University of Oslo, and I see that Myanmar is on this bottom 20 list, and it's been a country that's been in an intricate sort of democratization process since 2011, but they have this sort of power sharing between the military and the civilian government. But at the same time, Aung San Suu Kyi has sort of made her into sort of this personalist cult. So I'm really interested to hear your take on the future of Myanmar, especially considering the 2020 elections.
Myanmar is also really fascinating because it had probably one of the most oppressive military types of rule, I mean, really totalitarian. And then they were just struggling so much economically, they decided they had to open up and reform. So they reform a little bit, and it looked like they were democratizing on the road to democracy, and it stalled for a couple of reasons. One, the military still has power, and they still have 25% of the seats, so are allocated to them automatically. They never really left. And then I would have to say that she is very personalistic, and it has been a huge disappointment in terms of what people thought that she was some great Democrat. She has been very personalistic, very sort of abandoning the human rights agenda that we thought might be happening, just completely off what I think was predicted. And Myanmar is suffering, is struggling as a result of it. It was totally on the road to sort of democratizing. In fact, it had huge gains, and then has really kind of just started to stall and actually backslide even. And I think this will have very negative effects for Myanmar. It's not going to keep going in the positive direction that we thought it was going to. And it seems to be sort of this weird setup of someone that has has de facto very personalistic power in the military. And the military just never really left. So that in the end leads to very like a stalled democratization. Similar to Egypt, never really left.
My name is Mujahid. I work for European Center for Intelligence and Counter-Terrorist Studies, and at the same time I'm a PhD student at Brunel University. I'd just like to ask you a question regarding there is a lot of dictatorship all around the world, Middle East and there's a past like Iraq and Syria, current dictatorships. And just my question is, removing the dictatorship, usually imposing a sort of democracy coming by the West. And this is caused a conflict another conflict inside the country. So would be leaving the people to decide the way of democracy they want could be a better than imposing or importing another democracy from like UK or West or Europe or United States and impose it in this country, and then this will lead to another chaos maybe, because you don't know the culture. Even between the Arab countries, the culture is very different between each country. It's Iraqi is different than Saudis, are different than Yemenis. Still, they are all Arabs, but the culture is different. The way they grown up is different completely. So, putting aside sort of democracy into these countries could be lead another chaos and could be make the peoples give them mercy for the dictatorship. They said, "Oh, we used to live in peace." So this is my question: is imposing a democracy from the West could be a right solution? At the time, for people, they have no clue about the democracy because they have never been tested this beautiful things they heard about it from the West: democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of talk, freedom of walk, freedom of.
Right. No, it's a good question. And so democracy by imposition doesn't have a particularly great track record. There's some cases where the U.S. invaded Panama, it became democratic. These are really more they're more of an outlier, really. It tends to be best if democracy sort of evolves slowly over time and happen kind of organically, and where the domestic actors are involved in the process, crafting the institution. They could be consulting, but they're sort of leading the process. It could be very, very slow, which sometimes the West doesn't like. There's a real rush to hold elections really quickly before parties have developed, before a constitution maybe has been kind of put in place, before the rule of law has been established. And that's this whole group of literature about sequentialism, and that it may be better to not only be slow, but to wait until parties have developed before you push for elections. So democracy by imposition, as I already mentioned, it can really backfire. I mean, it can go really, really badly in some cases. The most notable case, of course, with Iraq. And Afghanistan has struggled as well, as they're trying to kind of impose something that's very foreign instead of waiting for things to develop slowly. But in terms of like what the international community can offer, you can still support civil society. You can still support civic programs to just learn about democracy, what it is, what governance, how it could work. It doesn't necessarily need to be you have to do it. It's more this is what it is. And so there's been some success with civic education programs. In the case of Myanmar, there were civic education programs, and they had found that some of the words of like just even democracy didn't exist in the vocabulary. So it's really foreign stuff that you're trying to kind of, can you imagine just kind of putting institutions in place that people haven't experienced before? It requires a lot of time, and oftentimes the international community is very impatient and wants everything, wants results very, very quickly. But there are factors that are conducive to democracy, that help build strong democracies, that you can sort of build and support without saying you got to have elections. Because elections, anyone can hold elections, and it's very common. Most dictatorships do hold elections. But I think there's a rush to impose something that might need to take more time to develop.
Please. What I would like to, I am born in that part of the world, so I understand the culture as well as the religion. I was born in the religion, and I still carry it. But when you say that culturally there are different cultures, I agree in the sense that yes, different songs, different food, different, a bit of little differences. But if you want to measure, you have to look at the commonalities in these countries, and the commonalities is the law that is not based on any kind of democratic values. Because if you look at women's rights, if you look at minority rights, you can see the differentiation. Now, this is where I think it's the role of those who have been privileged to live in the West. The West is not all sexual freedoms, and this is what the Middle East fear most, okay, because they think that once you have this freedom and these things, and this is where the West failed within his own citizens who immigrated to these countries, in the sense that showing the values of democracy, the values of, to accept the other, to discuss with the other, debate, and this thing. And this is where I think it is our responsibility to try to explain to our home countries that there is no fear from democracy. Because, if I want to look at democracy, it is not compatible with theology at all. It's not compatible, and therefore I want superiority of a law that make me an equal human being wherever I am, and that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman over here, and that's the last question.
Thank you. I'm Peter Paropoulos, my master development in real estate. So democracy and religion, is there a connection between these two? And if yes or no, can you please tell us more about this?
Democracy and religion? Well, you can have countries that are democratic, that are secular, and ones that are less secular. It's
democracy, dictatorship, sorry.
Dictatorship and religion?
Yes.
Okay. Well, no, there's dictatorships that are very secular, and dictatorships that use religion as a way of sort of subduing everybody. So I wouldn't say there's one trend or another, because we've had plenty of dictatorships that are completely secular, that the religion is about the leader, even. I would say in North Korea, they created a religion around this family, myths around this family. So if they don't have the religion that subdues everybody, and that they sort of can pretend that there's some sort of traditional figure that is critical to this religion, then they'll use something else. It's usually a made-up ideology based on themselves. There was Mobutuism, and Gaddafi had a green book that he made everybody read. And Juche in North Korea, they all have something that's this fake thing that they created that tends to lose its ideological power over time, and it becomes really more about economic transactions. I'm going to give you this if you just leave me alone and let me stay in power. So it usually dissipates over time.
Okay, I'm going to bring this to a close. I just want to thank Natasha for being here today, and for the audience for your engaging questions. We'll make the recording available later on today, and can we just thank Natasha for her time and presentation as well.